Thanks, Brett.
Have you guys got that screen of mine now?
Yeah, all good.
Cool. Yeah, I'm not zooming in from Brisbane, unfortunately. I'm zooming in from about 200 metres away from you guys, locked in my hotel room. But hopefully that all finishes soon. Thanks very much. And some of you have seen some parts of this presentation. It's sort of changed substantially. I'm going to focus today really on what it is, what it's not, and what it could be. I do have some videos. I trust that they're going to show up fine. So a whole bunch of different things that we put into the water and tow around, and I think you'll find, you know, if you've seen the gear yesterday, if you managed to see either of the two gliders on the stand or watch the video, you realise it's fairly different to most of these things. The thing I wanted to focus on is this, you know, I had a particular purpose in mind. Every one of those vehicles can probably squeeze in 4 people, travels on the road and uses fuel, but you would choose a different one for a different task. And my point of the various technologies is that it is sensible to choose a different one for a different task. I set out to do something that was like the manta-tow, very, very much modelled on manta-tow, but perhaps better, looking at a speed range of 2 to 9 knots and being able to cover 100 kilometres in a day on a single battery. At the moment, it ranges in depth from absolutely shallow, so half a metre, down to say 20 metres. We've equipped it with a new wing that I believe will test out to 30, 40 metres, and I'm not stopping till I get to 50. I'm going to show you something in a minute about left-right cross-track flight, which is quite different to most of the things that get dragged behind a boat. Has some minimal crewing benefits. Because of the high frame rate, we have a spatial resolution of our new data points every 15 centimetres forward along a track. And of course, live analysis and 100% archiving of data. So in other words, it's kind of like manta-tow, but it does all these other things a little bit better. First thing I wanted to say is now that is actually 3 prototypes old. The current prototype's in fact a little smaller and a little less ungainly. That's my grandson, oldest of them, 11 years old. He was unable to assemble that glider, but the current glider he can assemble himself and he can launch it. And in fact, he even drives my boat after he's launched it. So it can be a relatively inexperienced novice operator with relatively little training that uses the glider. I want to make the point about what's different about Vertigo from other things, and the point I want to say is this: it has 4 movable and independently controllable control surfaces, and it's built to have very, very low drag and to fly fast and to literally fly like an aeroplane. At the moment, it does that via a tow cable. There is a path to autonomy in the future, but the tow cable has a very, very specific function. The other thing that a number of people yesterday commented on was they were a little uncertain about that V-tail, but the point I want to make with respect to that is you can see a couple of images there. Aircraft which seek to be particularly efficient and manoeuvrable often go to something like a V-tail configuration. There are a number of benefits to it. And whilst it looks like there's no rudder or elevator, the V-tail functions as both, and those wings function as ailerons and flaps as well. And critically too, the body has a very, very wide, high vertical profile. In any event, fast enough to overcome currents, etc. But you can see there in that video, the glider is capable of traversing a cross track very quickly. One of the options that gives us, here's a manta-tow vessel. It's scaled approximately right, with an 18-metre tow rope. That would be it on the left. So the boat's traversing a track, and the person on the end of the rope can traverse left and right of the boat's track a small amount, and therefore their swath width, their effective observation swath width, is relatively narrow. Vertigo 3 on a 30-metre cable, which is where we tend to run it, can head out to 15 metres either side of the boat, and it can do so very, very quickly. Great manoeuvrability. We regularly run Vertigo 3 on 100-metre cable lengths, but we can in fact run it on much longer cable lengths too. And you can see here that one of the possibilities that allows is that in rough weather, the towing vessel stands off the edge of the reef and the glider can be sent in to the surf zone where the boat would not want to go. The other option that you have when you have controllable, authoritative left-right of track movement is the ability to fly multiple gliders at once and to task them with different things, maybe one shallow, one mid, one deeper. Now, to be clear, that is not a capability that we have at the moment, but we have sensors that we need to be able to do that. And later on, once I've got things in the water and functioning properly, we'll look at that. It has a robotic camera system, and yes, it's a 5-megapixel camera. The imagery you've seen to date was from an early lens, which we just paired with it for prototype testing purposes, which was a 3-megapixel rated lens in a 5-megapixel camera. We've now gone to a proper lens, but I otherwise plan to stick with that particular camera flying above the seabed, a couple of metres off the seabed, where we can do several things. Of course, we eliminate the fact that dirty water limits visibility, and we put the glider down at a position where the glider can see down the edges of a bommy. The way the image system of the glider is, it can in fact see behind a bommy as it flies over. And with the new flight control capabilities that we have, you can do things like rotate the glider onto its side to look at a wall more directly, or even to look underneath a plate coral if you can fly the glider. If the plate coral's on the slope and you can fly the glider down below the level of a plate coral, you can roll the glider until you see it. I want to make a point too about vision systems, and that is, and this is robotic vision systems in general, the human eye has fantastic visual acuity in a very, very small patch. If you took any old sheet of paper and put it at arm's length and stare at the first word in the first sentence, you would undoubtedly, well, hey, my eyes are failing a little bit these days, but I can certainly see that word very, very clearly. But if you look about a thumb's width away, already you can't make out individual letters. And this is not just Brett's eyes, this is the human eye in general. I encourage you to try it one day, because that then tells you why even a 5-megapixel robotic camera is way better than the peripheral vision of a human. And when I say peripheral vision, I mean pretty much outside of that 1 or 2 degrees of the fovea. So some of this you've seen before. I am skipping over a fair bit of it, but clearly there's every 200 odd meters of manta-tow data points. The data points you see here in the middle of this image are from our tow around Llewellyn. And what you don't perhaps realise is that every one of those little blue dots, so the orange dots are the manta-tow positions from the preceding Cots team survey of that about 4 weeks beforehand. There's observations of Cots that we've made there. But the blue dots aren't each observation point of ours. They're in fact every 150th observation point of ours. So within a manta-tow, we would be on average, within a 2-minute manta-tow at about, say, 2.5 to 3 knots, we would be collecting on average about 1,230 images. I want to say here, once this is the Reef Interventions manta-tow around Llewellyn back in late June, 25 starfish. 4 weeks later, so there's a temporal effect, or possibly, we found in human review of the archive footage, 50 odd starfish, and a whole bunch more once the machine learning got in there and started to identify them. Interestingly enough, 40% of all of the crown of thorns starfish that we could identify in the video and that the ML was able to identify in the video were visible in the video sequence for less than a second. Now that has a whole bunch of implications, including If you reduce your frame rate, then you will miss more and more of those starfish in a purely detection sense, and you also miss the ability to track them through multiple frames and do statistics on things like size measurements in a particular frame. In any event, um, you know, the way, sorry, that's a slide I semi left in there, but you can see that the target there at this screen resolution, you can, in fact, you can't see that that's really a starfish. There's something down there. But that's 6 or 7 meters down from the glider in a trench where the glider's flight path might actually be, sort of across the top of the trench. Point here is that the yellow frames are the 3 frames in a 5 frame sequence. So that was over a 330 millisecond sequence where the starfish was actually visible. It's partially behind a piece of coral that you see when you can zoom in, but even at this level of zoom, that's not terribly obvious. Point there is, again, um, if I had to, I would choose a camera which had an even higher frames per second so that we can then begin to do some funky things looking at instead of looking at confidence in inferences on a um, per inference basis, so in other words, treating each frame individually, we can look at the sequence of inferences that appear as the starfish tracks through a video. And, and we have a method then where we're looking at and evaluating alternate strategies. Do we go with an absolute threshold or a summative confidence over however many frames? Do we look for a trend line? And I know, for example, when I review video, if the first if the first inference is high confidence level and the confidence level decreases, then it's probably not a starfish. Or n frames over a threshold. So there's a number of ways of analyzing that come from the fact we have high frequency, well tracked using optical flow tracking. So also wanted to say high frame rate also works very good for things like this. We're using mathematics and the declination angle of the camera relative to the seabed, looking wide rather than just down. And therefore the maths works poorly at low declination rates where a small change, even a pixel size change in the apparent location of a target in the image frame yields a very, very different number. But we're seeing starfish for, 20, 30, 40, 70 frames in a row. And therefore we can, whether it's geolocation, depth estimation, size estimation, whatever, we have a high, replication level per starfish for determining metrics. Of course, that then opens up opportunities where we can do things like size frequency distributions as we go. We have also run, and this is very much stuff that's come out of the CSIRO side of the collaboration. And I'm going to take a pause there and to say, this project started with me about 3 and a little bit years ago. And after a year or so, when the first glider was flying, I took the idea to CSIRO. Thank heavens for guys like Andy Stephen and Bruno Cusi, who probably went a little bit out on a limb organisationally wise, but backed the project, and we were able to do some really nice things in the collaboration. And just to sort of put a bow around that, the parties have agreed that we will just simply cross-license each other technology. So that's the way forward for us in an IP and tech-wise sense. But I did want to say. This particular training exercise for habitat classes was rough and ready and needs refinement, needs additional training sets and things like that. But the beautiful thing about this too is that those set of inferences and a percentage hard coral, soft coral, rubble, etc., can be performed every 15 centimeters forward. And therefore we have a high replication level to be able to aggregate up to, for example, a scale of 5 or 10 meters, in which we might well have, 50 observations to average. So delivering at the moment, we're focused very, very much on filling in the gaps for the existing manta-towing data sheet. Obviously, the data fidelity and that should be higher, and removing bias and all those kind of things. What could it be in the future? Well, there are pathways by which we could have multiple gliders deployed by approximately September. That would require starting work now, though, rather than at some point after July. Um, we certainly see pathways for covering a lot more ground, i.e. the gliders are quite fast. We have flown them at up to 9 knots in Moreton Bay. Um, but even a more steady rate, we're commonly towing at approximately 5 knots. Um, and so 3 to 5 reefs per day per glider. You don't require that many gliders, perhaps located in 2 or 3 regions within the GBR, to be able to cover the entire set of reefs every year, even a couple of times. We also have this ability to put multiple gliders per boat and task them differently. We have the ability to refine the geolocation capability for particular targets. So from plus or minus about 3 meters and depth-wise plus or minus about 0.2, both of those can be refined through increasing the complexity in our models at the moment. That has an interesting set of implications around dive operations. If the dive team knew in advance where the starfish were, and I'll come back to this whole thing of yes, but it doesn't see everything. If they knew where they were to within a few meters laterally and which depth they were in, then suddenly you have the opportunity to send in fewer divers or, in fact, snorkelers to target small numbers with a, um, a data display that basically says, well, there's actually at least 10 here within a space of 20 meters, so you probably ought to send the divers in there. The ability to track starfish positions also gives you perhaps an ability in the future to look at, instead of just killing starfish, which for the coral that they are eating, perhaps you start to kill starfish because you recognize that by their size or their potential contribution to fecundity or the degree of aggregation amongst starfish, that you can prioritize them on the basis of potential future recruitment. Obviously, the finer scale data might allow you to adopt sub-reefal management strategies then. I think there's plenty of evidence that we will expand the machine learning capability on that current video stream to include fish and other indicators of reef health. And of course, then I think there's, in the longer term, there's a pathway to full economy. That particular glider flies with exceptionally low drag and would require less than 10% of the power that most of the larger autonomous vehicles require to push itself through the water at speed, which opens up some really cool things in terms of dead reckoning between navigation fixes and the like. That's kind of all I wanted to say. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I didn't even watch the time, but I'm assuming I did that.